we like to talk about issues that I think are very pertinent and at the same time that don't convolute a lot of these topics. So if you're listening to this, our goal is you get something valuable that you can take action on. You get an idea, you get an insight that you can turn into something valuable for your business in a very short period of time because there's an enormous amount of podcasts and articles and you name it out there that you could be interacting with. So today I have Ken Cowan with me, our VP of Business Development, and we were having a conversation recently, Ken, talking about a survey that we did back in May. And we always like to take time to reflect on what do our customers tell us, how they're feeling about the industry, and how does that actually play out? And what does it really mean for the industry going forward, especially as we're all wrapping up the year, going into 2026? What's the outlook? So let's talk about it.
Yeah, let's happy to. So we went out and talked to about 200 precision manufacturers. Most of them were paperless parts customers, not all of them. And we came away with a bunch of conclusions. Some that I think were probably a little surprising to us at the time, and some that I think you probably would have expected had you thought about what would happen. Like, just looking at this, one of the ones that actually surprised me a little bit was just that people were generally pretty optimistic, right? So this is
Yeah.
picture yourself middle of the year. We had
One was
basically
brutal. Q1 was a hard quarter. I mean,
Q1
geez,
was brutal,
the
and yet,
uncertainty and
you had
liberation day.
tariffs, and yet you had basically. I mean, I was looking at this. We had 53% of suppliers describe themselves as at least cautiously optimistic, and another 29% saying that they were very optimistic. And that was in the face of what everybody was staring down the barrel of tariffs and real uncertainty about their material costs.
Yeah, it brings me to this concept of I think you're to define it in a word, uncertainty. I think really this whole report highlighted the uncertainty, cautious optimism across the field, but uncertainty as it related to tariffs, as it related to reshoring, as it related to what the outlook from a revenue and an investment perspective was going to look like. And I think that uncertainty it highlights that instability is bad for supply chains, right? I mean, I think more and more we've been hearing this concept of supply chain resiliency being the primary focus. So it's not so much harsh cost cutting reductions, albeit sourcing folks are always going to be pushing for the best price. So I think it would be naive to say that no. Now they're focused on spending more money and driving resiliency. Like that would just be foolish. But at the end of the day, I think more and more people are focused on the long-term effects of instability in the industrial supply chain.
I think what you've seen, I think this has happened particularly in aerospace, but to a lesser extent in some of the lack of capacity that we've seen in the industrials sectors around semiconductors and energy and a couple of the others, is this concept of we've been bit. Like, I think there was an expectation. I mean, we spent the last 30 years basically going through an exercise that I would describe as cost engineering. So let's take and push as much of cost out of our supply chain as possible while also putting as much work into the supply chain, right? So it's both outsourcing as well as squeezing. And what you ended up with was this kind of like Jenga tower of a supply chain. And that's not a problem as long as nothing happens. But if
Yeah.
there's one thing we all know, it's that something always happens.
Yeah, the concept of elasticity and inelasticity really comes to mind here. I think we got really inelastic supply chains. And what I mean by that is the inability to absorb a shock or respond positive or negative, but this inability to ramp production quickly or downscale production or handle the fluctuating S&OP that's trying to mirror a geopolitical environment that then is being dictated by consumer sentiments. It's that inelasticity in supply chains, I think, is the thing that, when people talk about resiliency, I think that's actually what they mean,
Yeah,
is they want an elastic supply chain.
that's exactly right. So a couple examples. So we have seen in semiconductors in particular, there is this ongoing statement that you will hear if you hear any of the call it the captains of the semiconductor industry, the people who are actually driving the capex, which is that I will take any capacity you can give me. That is both on the energy side, where we would love to build nuclear reactors, but we know for a lot of reasons, primarily regulatory, we're not going to, because it takes at least 7 years to build a nuclear reactor. And we know we will take all the energy we can possibly get. Same thing on the semiconductor side. It's very easy to think that ASML, Lam, Applied, those are the only companies that are actually producing these things. The fact is, those are design houses primarily that do final assembly. They have supply chains that they have to rely on. Those supply chains are, in many cases, the limiting function to being able to ramp up. So, what's happening is what you've just described, which is there's an enormous shock to the system. Now, in this case, it was a massive positive shock that nobody was expecting,
Yeah.
but it means that the supply chain can't keep up. We were just at a shop, not a shop, a scaled component hardware manufacturer not that long ago, who's saying basically their biggest concern is that they will be unable to ramp production to the level needed. And
Yeah.
so they'll end up having to change their designs and go elsewhere.
Yeah. Yeah. I think this whole topic reminds me of just an important statement, and it's that manufacturing is not commoditized. And I think that the complexity is not free. And I think there's a misconception there that just because I have a machine shop or just because I have a fabricator, they should be able to produce anything I throw at them. And in reality, I think as engineering software has gotten more and more powerful, which is fantastic, and it's allowed engineers to design in more complexity to produce a better end component for their customers. Well, it's required a lot more supply chain specialization and CapEx that goes into that equipment that allows the supply chain to be more specialized. And it's like, great, but that also means a very specialized supply chain, if they have a specific piece of equipment that produces certain types of components, if the demand dries up for that, they're in they're in deep trouble. It's not like they can just pivot that machine to going and producing something else. Like, I think there's this, like, job shop fallacy that, like, oh, if you produce parts for oil and gas, you can make parts for aerospace, or you can make parts for semiconductor or medical devices. Like, no, it's actually quite specialized. And it requires different outsourced supply chains. It requires different supply chain management in the shop for their outside vendors, requires different material supply chains. Like, it's complicated. It's not just this, hit a commodity and, send back a part, be done.
It's such an important point. We've come across recently in discussions this concept of basically the fallacy of generic capacity, which
Yeah.
is this concept that basically says, okay, it's a machined part. All right, well, machining is typically roughly thought of as either milling or turning. Technically, fabrication, sheet metal fabrication is actually machining, but let's keep it to where people like to think about it. But milling and turning in themselves are not just generic buckets. The amount of sophistication that has gone in, I mean, watch a Titans of CNC video and we can see exactly the breadth of what something can be done if you really want to, something extraordinarily complex, like what might go in an aircraft engine,
Yep.
all the way down to something that is actually a really simple machined part that can be produced at low for low cost. That to be able to have that spectrum of capability to produce that means that you've got something that is extremely hard to produce, that's high value, that you're going to do probably really low numbers, and something that it actually doesn't really matter the number of things you're going to do because it's relatively cheap to do. what you're seeing a lot of right now, outside of a few specific places in the supply chains, is that they're being treated like generic capacity by the sourcing team.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. And I think when you pair that with just like, let's go up to 60,000 feet, right? The US industrial base for machining and fabrication is tens of thousands of small distributed businesses. And it's highly fragmented. And these businesses are a lot of times family owned, more recently starting to become private equity owned. But we're talking about businesses that are doing 5 to 10 million in revenue and sometimes less. There's not a lot of fat there.
Mhm.
And they're making decisions on equipment for projects. Like the number of times we talk to customers that are going out and buying a machine for a specific project. If that project gets cut, that project changes, you can end up in a really, really bad cash position. And
Mhm.
that is the opposite of a resilient supply chain from my perspective. And a lot of that is like, I love that shops can take on new work and go buy equipment and scale their business, partnering with their customers. That is a great motion. And at the same time, I think the onus should be on the customer to then feed them more work for that piece of equipment. It's like, don't give me just one part number for this new piece of equipment that I'm buying to produce this part number for you. Go out and consolidate as many parts as I can put on this thing. So if your demand signal changes, I'm not going to be left holding the bill.
So let's double click on this. Why does it matter to be profitable if you've got a supply chain? Because as I look at it, it's not Boeing's responsibility to make sure that Boeing suppliers are profitable. That's the supplier's responsibility. They have their own businesses.
Yeah. I think it's a really valid question, right? It's like, why are you making your problem my problem? And I think at the end of the day, when I look back at books like Toyota Way and the approach to just-in-time manufacturing and lean and just very collaborative supply chains, these switching cost is incredibly expensive. Moving parts from one supplier to another, the delays. So, yeah, is it Boeing's problem or is it, name that OEM's problem that their suppliers are profitable? Not really, but is it in their best interest to have profitable suppliers? Absolutely. Like I don't think it should be their problem to go engineer profitability for their customers, but if they can take steps on their side of the table to drive economies of scale for these businesses that allow them to reinvest in their business, to buy equipment, to scale up, to kind of get out of this danger zone of the, sub 5 million in revenue, sub 10 million in revenue. I think it's in everybody's best interest.
So
So,
is this
yeah,
so are we having the supply chain now provide welfare?
it's a really interesting question. I don't think of it that way. I think of it like think of these as supply chain partnerships, and folks tend to say the word partnership, but don't really mean partner. It's like, "You're our partner," but actually, no, like, you're the whipping post for us that's like, we don't care, and if you go out of business, we'll just, unapologetically move work to someone else in our supply chain. That, I think people are realizing is not a long-term sustainable model. Like, I
Yeah.
do not think it produces the best possible outcome. And so instead of saying, no, 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 we're just going to pay you more for parts so you can be more profitable, I think there are very small steps that OEMs can take to be more targeted in the way they're sourcing to help the supply chain be more elastic. It's like it's this look at certain programs and certain approved vendor lists. For each program, it can be a completely different set of vendors, even though the parts across programs are actually very similar. And then you think about it and it's like, okay, well, what are we doing here? If one program gets cut or something happens to that program, I'm putting the whole supply chain at risk rather than consolidating across programs so that if one program experiences a drawback, well, there's enough water to keep the boats floating. And I think that it used to be looked at as a strategic risk in supply chain to consolidate too much buying with one supplier. And that was from the perspective of the supplier is going to have too much power. They're going to have too much supplier power in negotiations, where they'll have too much of our spend. Well, they'll start to turn the screws to us. Maybe, but at the end of the day, where the real value is not in the unit price of the part. It's in the ability to absorb the shocks in the supply chain and ramp up to meet customer needs. Like, when you think about, like, these companies reporting to Wall Street, it's how many cars did you ship? How many airplanes did you ship? How many units did you deliver? Very rarely is it like, "Oh, like, your margins on X parts or your costs here moved up." It's more about delivery and rev rec than cost basis. Like, the cost basis is not fluctuating that much to begin with. At least that's my perspective on it. I think there would be a lot of people that would argue with that perspective, but I look at it at the end of the day is if you're able to continue to accelerate to meet, like, look at, we're, I read something the other day that says we have the most historic backlog in aerospace that we've ever had in existence of the industry. Is that what I think you're probably seeing the same things in the conversations you're having.
They
It's just like
actually
a matter.
came out. The news came out this morning that Airbus, the CEO of Airbus on a French radio station, said that they thought that Boeing would beat them for the first time in 6 years in the order race this year. But Boeing had 1,000 net orders, so 1,000 total orders at the end of the day that got added. They had 908 cancellations. So they had to have 1,900 orders to have 1,000 net orders. So
And you think about that like, everyone talks about bullwhip, right? And the concept of bullwhip in the supply chain is a very small movement here causes chaos downstream. Well, that's not a small movement, right? We're talking that is a huge movement. Think about what that does to an entire supply chain and, like, forecasting investments. I was on with a private equity that's looking to scale up one of their businesses the other day, and we're talking about what it takes to scale capacity in a shop. The time from making the investment decision to additional operating capacity is like 6 to 9 months.
so you talk about whenever there's a problem or an opportunity in business, it typically is broken down into people, process, and technology. I actually think we're missing one. I think it's people, process, technology, and cash.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah, the ability to
exactly,
do it.
CapEx, OpEx, whatever it is, right? Because when you then were to look at, say, okay, so what do we do, right? So we just described a whole bunch of dynamics that are happening in the
Yeah.
supply chain. We basically said, look, we need to be thinking about the idea that total landed cost over time is what you need to worry about, not just your direct materials cost in a perfect world. And that if you're doing that, that's short term. We think about a resilient supply chain is a profitable one because it's able to absorb the hits that happen that hadn't really had a major supply shock since COVID. But then we also had the AI boom in 2023 that all of a sudden have this and a seeming renaissance in A&D that's
Yeah.
causing two places where this is happening. One, the legacy players are putting more volume in, but also Anduril and the upstarts are all pushing the existing supply base to produce more. So you
Oh,
say,
yeah.
all right, what do we do about this, right? So I think that same framework you can use. So you can say, do we at the OEM, but also does our supply chain have the right people in it? Because there's things you can do. Do they have the right processes? Well, we can help a lot there because training is something that, you go into a facility at an OEM and it's typically pretty well run. A lot of your suppliers could potentially learn from that, right? And there are centers of excellence, but is that a focus? Or is that just
CCAT.
some right?
CCAT and their partnership with Pratt is a perfect example of training the supply chain. They're putting so much effort into how do you utilize model-based definition files. That's just good business.
Exactly. So
Yeah,
you
like,
got your people.
yep.
So do we have the right talent? So in that case, we need to make sure that we've got positions like estimators. Like Those are one of the skilled jobs, machinists, right? We know we need more of those. Like you can say you're going to automate away all you want, but still having the core competency of the skilled roles will matter. People, processes, do we have the processes? Are we in the right training? Do we have the right technology? So
Yeah.
again, same thing. Do we at the sourcing side, at the supply chain side, at the operations side, at the QA side, do we have technology that we feel like is modern, scalable, gives us answers we didn't have yesterday? Like, do we
Yeah.
have a plan to have more answers tomorrow than we did yesterday? Because if the answer is no, we should probably think into that. Same
And
thing in the supply chain.
and that process and technology are concentric circles in a lot of places. I just think about CMMC compliance, and it's everyone's been talking about it since November when it actually became a thing, and everyone was like, "Oh my gosh, like they did it!" Like it's been getting dragged out for almost a decade. Um, but I look at the shops that have taken the steps to go out and make the investment to check the box and to be CMMC compliant. They're some of our most profitable customers. And they've done it because they know that that makes them a better supplier. We got hit up yesterday from a shop who needs to go through CMMC in 2 weeks. And they're like, "We have to do it. We have to do it. We're a huge one of our huge customers." This is not a small business either, but huge customer says we have to have it, have to meet it. How do we do this? And it's like, you we've been telling you for years that this is a thing. Like, luckily, paperless parts, it's flip a few switches and we help you check a lot of those boxes. But just from like, is that a resilient supply chain? So what's the cost? Like, sure, they'll go get CMMC compliance. Will it take 2 weeks? Probably not. Probably take 6 months. But what does that mean for delivery?
Hmm.
And what does that mean for supply chain readiness? So like if your suppliers are pinching pennies so hard that they're not willing to put the cybersecurity process and technology in place to support it, do you have a resilient supply chain? My argument would be no. And so to your point, what's the fourth? Right? We've got people, process, technology,
And cash. So
cash,
that's your last one. And we've
right?
seen that, right? We've seen that happen where we've seen um, whether it's just complete like Boeing and Spirit, where they're buying back a previous set of plants, basically, all the way to we've seen just in the wake of COVID a lot of financial assistance that has had to happen. But that's a great example of a cost that would be off the balance sheet, off the P&L on the supply chain side. Like, sure, you have people, and yeah, you're going to account for it, but I guarantee the management P&L is not thinking about reforecasting. Wait a minute,
Yeah.
do we do we need to take an expense against how we're thinking about supporting our shops financially, our suppliers financially into the next 4 years for when the next shock happens and we have to go save a bunch of suppliers? Like
Yeah.
that is not when we're thinking about cost engineering and resiliency, sure, we're thinking about getting the line going. We're thinking about stopping traveled work so it forces us to find the components that we didn't have. Right? Like yes, that's all really really helpful. But there's a full sale question here about how are we thinking about supply chain? How do we bear hug suppliers and not have or start to kind of defray what had become an extremely um, kind of antagonistic relationship, in particular in the aerospace industry?
Yeah, it's almost adversarial. And I think we were talking to an advisor of ours earlier in the year, and he was explaining supply chain has always been an afterthought in aerospace and defense. It's not made the top 5 on CEOs' lists of priorities until now. And that's an interesting byproduct of the profitability of aerospace and defense. When you have a fairly profitable organization that can deliver and has government contracts, supply chain is just kind of a necessary thing. And it's like, I'm more interested in I'm more interested in sales. I'm more interested in new product design. I'm more interested in making sure that my cost basis in my internal operating is engineered properly. And then supply chain is kind of an afterthought. I think that's changing quite a bit. I do think COVID was a fairly solid wake up call. But if you think about the COVID swing that we saw at paperless parts and just in our data, the bounce out of COVID, I mean, you watched RFQ volume, order volume start to start to fall pretty substantially there in the like 20, like mid 2020 timeframe. And the bounce back 9 months, 12 months later was unreal. I mean, just huge, huge, huge volumes. And it's just this, and I think there's an interesting thing happening right now from a CapEx perspective. People, the OEMs will hold inventories of parts. And when things get risky for them, they'll just start to burn inventories and they'll pause orders. And they'll burn down that inventory. And then when they go place the order again, it's double, right? It's, I'm going to go fill my inventory back up and I'm going to buy what I've been buying from you. So here's that like whip in the supply chain, right? That bounces back. Well, there's a really interesting constricting that's happening as a result of interest rates. So people are now holding less in inventory. So there's a less to burn down. So the shocks in the supply chain they're it's much more frequent. We're seeing just like fishtailing in demand and orders being placed, LTAs going out, LTAs being paused. I do think this is going to be going into 2026. I am optimistic for stability. And I do think that, we've heard this from the likes of like GE and Lockheed and Northrop and the big players in aerospace and defense are starting to think about how can we be more targeted
Mhm.
in our sourcing. And this comes back to 2013, the term digital thread came out. And it's like, so why do people want a digital thread? Well, you talked about this maybe 10 minutes ago on this in this discussion, but understanding the total ownership cost of a part allows you to make much better sourcing decisions from a unit cost perspective. If you only have a couple of vectors to make decisions on, lead time, unit price, historical supplier quality. Okay,
At the
like
supplier level, not at the
at the
part
supply,
level.
yeah, no, yeah, exactly at the supply at the supplier level. If that's all you have to make a decision on, well, what are you going to optimize for? You optimize for LPTA, lowest price technically available, and that is it. Like I'm optimizing for that. I'm going to make supply chain decisions and go. But now, if I understand risk at a part level and I understand total ownership cost of the part because I do have connectivity from design through supply chain to delivery to performance in the field. Now, all of a sudden, now I have a more complete picture to make different decisions. Like, do I care about? We talked about this a lot in COVID, and one of the big hypotheses driving reshoring or nearshoring is that for a long time, supply chains would look at going over to Asia and buying parts, and they would say, "Look, I'm buying 100,000 parts a year. I can save $1 a part in Asia. That's $100,000 a year, and if I do, maybe let's call it $10 a part, like whatever relativity, right? So I'm gonna save $1 million a year if I go buy these parts there." Well, then they would look at it and they would say, okay, well, what's the realistic potential for a disruption and how much does that hurt me? So they would say, okay, we're going to hold a little bit more inventory on our side. And there's probably not going to be a supply chain disruption that disrupts for more than 30 days, right? It's just unfathomable to think like, a ship gets stuck in the Oakland port, like whatever. Like, fine, 30 days, we'll prepare for that shock. Well, then COVID happened and everybody was like, holy crap, I can't get parts for 5 months. And so
Can't
now
sell anything. Can't make anything.
yeah,
Can't deliver
nothing.
anything.
Literally can deliver nothing. So
Yeah.
then now there's this whole new calculus that went into that risk equation. So whereas the risk equation was we're gonna have a supply chain disruption, that's gonna happen once every 5 years. That disruption is gonna cost us $1 million. Over 5 years, we save $5 million. We're net 4. I'll do that all day, right? That's the math. Buy these 100,000 parts every 5 years. There will be a little blip of a problem, but we'll absorb that and we'll be net four positive. Let's go do it. Well, COVID was like, holy crap, we lost $10 million because of this,
Right.
because we couldn't deliver for 6 months on orders. Then the orders got canceled, and then they went to a competitor, and that like future earnings potential from that customer declined. Like the shockwave of that was dramatic. And I think that has really opened up, that was the catalyst for the need for supply chain resiliency.
Mhm.
Like, when people say that, what they really mean is elasticity in local supply chains.
Yep.
The ability to
Client
absorb.
capacity in particular.
Yes. Yeah.
We talk about surge capacity, and so I think, rounding out the discussion a little bit,
Yeah.
the core question becomes, how do you build a supply chain? How do you build a supply base that is compliant, has capacity, and that has the ability to withstand shocks in both directions? And if you can do that, the question then becomes, well, how do you do it? Well, probably the framework we'd suggest is people. Do your supply chain have the right people? I think they can think about that as, do I have the right suppliers? And do they have the right people? Processes. What can I do to work with my suppliers to make sure that everybody is sharing the best knowledge possible?
It starts with S&OP, starts with sales and operational planning and getting your supply chain involved really early in that.
That's right. From there, technology, sharing the best technology you know about, understanding the technology that they're using. Go to your best suppliers, understand what are they using, and then share that. And then financing. Do you have suppliers that need help with it? Are there ways for you to basically create areas that you share risk in? And if you have ways to create all four of those, that would be the playbook we would suggest to create that elastic, compliant capacity.
Yeah, and it's not that last piece, this is not a rocket science problem.
No.
A business, the typical shop runs 120 to 180-day cash operating cycle. Horrible, horrible cash operating cycles. If you have a part that you're buying from a shop that is $100,000 worth of however many quantities, and you're about to take that away, just do the math. If it's a $5 million business, what does that 100K shock do to the system? And could they potentially absorb that with their credit line? Well, does losing that work? You have to report your LTAs when you go get a credit line. Does losing that work hurt their credit line? And I'm not saying like you should just buy the parts anyways, but that's where being really strategic in sourcing across programs and allowing the shocks to balance each other out in the sine wave of supply chain bullwhip. If you can do that, you're going to have the most resilient supply chain. And whether those suppliers are profitable should not, profitability through your supply chain should be looked at as winning. If I'm running a business and I have a supply chain, I want them to be super profitable, because that means I picked the right suppliers for the parts that are being produced. It means I'm giving them the right batches of parts and we're communicating really effectively. And it means that when I go to accelerate or decelerate, the supply chain is going to be able to work with me. So
Right.
what I would leave people with is, I think the most resilient supply chains are the most profitable.
Awesome.
Good stuff, Ken. Fun chatting always. If folks have questions, please reach out to us. Um, Jason at paperlessparts.com, ken.cowan at paperlessparts.com. We'll make sure that we get you there. Hit us up on LinkedIn. We're happy to chat about this. If you disagree with us, please tell us. We'd love to hear it. And thanks for listening. Have a good one, folks.